Perfect. So we have 30 minutes before we need to break for lunch. I've put together a series of questions because I've been a little bit out of the loop with the INC process. Some of my other colleagues from the CSR have been participating quite actively in that. So I have a series of questions that I've put together that I'm going to be posing to our panel members. We also do have the WhatsApp group, so if we do have time towards the end of our 30-minute session, please pop questions up there. I noticed that there have been a lot of questions coming in already this morning, but for the panel now, we're going to be focusing specifically on the treaty and the road to the treaty. There are a lot of other questions in there for our speakers this morning, which I'm hoping they will either engage with directly via the WhatsApp group or catch them during lunchtime, or maybe during the course of the 2 days, we'll have time to answer some of those other questions. I also believe that there are 2 poll questions that are going to be posed. Are those on the WhatsApp group already? They are. Okay, great. So please feel free, participate in those, give your answers, and hopefully we can reflect on the answers to those 2 polls as well before we wrap up the panel session. All right, let's jump straight in. So my first question that I have is to the DDG, to Mamokhala. Thank you for the presentation that you gave so far in terms of where we are, what government's thinking is. I think, as someone who's looking at this process, I think we all want to achieve the same thing. If I look at the presentations, I'm seeing a common thread, which is reducing plastic pollution in the environment. That's our goal. We're approaching it as 3 different stakeholder groups. As government, and this is my interpretation, government who has a responsibility to protect in terms of environmental and human health. We're seeing industry that obviously has a certain agenda, an objective that they want to achieve, and business. But we all want to pull in the same direction. Overall, we all, I believe, want to achieve the same thing, which is to reduce the impact that plastic is having in our environment. And so I suppose the challenge going into this treaty process is how do we align our respective agendas and visions to make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction? How do we find that common ground that will allow us to achieve that? So the first question I have for you, DDG, we've seen it with the Paris Agreement when we're talking about climate change, an international treaty that was signed almost a decade ago, how government and civil society's intentions to address a major environmental issue can often be stalled or diluted. What is the minimum that the South African government would want to achieve out of the Global Plastics Treaty?
Yes, the elements are important, are significant already that have been mentioned. We've already talked about prioritized or problematic plastic products, however way you want to mention them. Those are key for us, a key element, because most of our pollution comes from there. If I could give an example, studies have been done in terms of what products are found as part of the litter. So already if we have a treaty that prioritized, it means we will have a criteria to identify these problematic products and then sort of list them together and work collectively towards reducing them and maybe changing the product design for those, because some, of course, are necessary applications, but we need to ensure that they don't have that impact on the environment. And already some at national level we've started, but I think we want everybody to join that. Critical is also the financial mechanism, because you can't just have measures that you don't have the necessary means of implementation to undertake them. And of course, because we are a developing country, we need to be mindful of some of the responsibilities and the obligations that would come up and whether we will have the capacity to undertake. So we want to ensure that the enabling, activities are catered for in terms of the resources. And that doesn't mean we want to take away the ability of, nations to raise their own funds. We are saying at a global level we need that, but even here at home, we've started with the EPR. Of course, we might not at this point have optimized our implementation, whether the fees are set at the right levels to collect all. Those are some of the things that we will need to work on as we implement.
So design and financing, two big take-home.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to pose my question just in the order that the presentations went, if you don't mind. So Anton, my next one that I'm going to pose is to you. A very similar kind of question to the one that I've just asked to Mamokhala. From representing the plastics industry, whether you want to talk on their behalf or personally your own, what you would like to see, what do you see as being the ideal outcome of the negotiations now at INC5 and I suppose ultimately of a global plastics treaty?
I think first of all there's a risk that we might not have an agreement at the end of the year. If we're going to stay as broad as we are with the divergence, it's going to be tough. But I'm confident that we will be able to narrow it down and be able to reach agreement at the end of the day. I think what will be critical is that we will have a workable and implementable treaty at the end of the day agreement. And specifically, if you take into consideration the local conditions and requirements of countries, that it's flexible enough to allow for that to be embedded and built into the local conditions. Otherwise, you might end up with global standards and targets and things that will just negatively impact on the economy and will not be implementable and not be able to be supported. So what is the end goal? And you raise it as well. We want to end plastic pollution. We want to stop leakage into the environment, and that is the critical part. How do we do it? I believe circular economy is quite critical to this. Yes, we need to redesign and reformulate some of our material. We need to look at reuse opportunities and so on. But at the end of the day, we also in South Africa specifically have a desperate need to close that loop, to get waste out of the environment by fixing the infrastructure, by ensuring that we can get clean material out of the environment, all the waste, and include other waste streams as well, to make sure that we can then properly sort it and deal with that. So yes, we need that support. We need that in enabling policies at the end of the day. From a government perspective, that will help us to achieve that. So a lot of collaboration, a lot of engagements that needs to take place to find that common goal that we all are happy with. But at the end of the day, for me, how do we stop leakage? How do we stop plastic pollution?
Thank you. Magna, to you, I was really comforted to see your presentation and the approach that business wants to take towards the treaty of recognizing the need for both upstream and downstream interventions. The question that I have to you is, what role do businesses, and I know you the coalition covers a broad spectrum of businesses, but what role do businesses play ultimately in the success of the Global Plastics Treaty? And I suppose once we do have a treaty, giving effect to it post that.
Thanks very much for the question, Linda. Businesses are at the forefront of implementing the treaty, and the continued engagement of business in this process is critical. First and foremost, I have to state that phasing out problematic plastics is something that we have been doing continuously. It's already embedded in the way in which we do business. But the treaty really provides the structure that we require to level the playing field, a set of rules that we can work and engage with. And I think it will also incentivize more reuse and product design improvement, which is something that I think is critical. But that is a role that we can play, provided that the treaty continues to engage us and provide that framework. But I think it's also important to note that business is able to invest in innovation and collaborating with government and other stakeholders, and the treaty will also provide that framework. So that's key reasons for us.
I suppose my instinct is always, I was never under the impression that business liked rules But it makes sense because, again, when I saw your slide, that it drives innovation. Rules help to reduce the risk, and as a scientist, someone who wants to see that innovation being pushed forward, it's really encouraging to see that. So I think we recognize that we need it. The exciting part is now how we give effect.
Absolutely. Cost of compliance is key for us. And if we can reduce that, it keeps us in business. So.
Absolutely. Just a reminder, if you haven't yet, please answer that poll. We're going to check in on the poll and see what your answers are to some of these 2 burning questions. All right, I'm going to circle back, Mamagala, to yourself. Government's perspective. I think we've seen it as well in the various presentations that we've had this morning, is that this term plastic is quite a broad concept. And it tends to get painted with the same brush. But not all plastics are equal. Plastic gets used in the construction industry, it gets used in the automotive industry where it gets locked up for a lengthy period of time. It gets used in the medical industry where it serves a very important purpose. It gets used in the agriculture sector, and we heard from our keynote speaker this morning the importance of South Africa's agriculture sector. But I suppose at the end of the day, what we kind of narrowing in on is what we tend to see in the environment, which is the packaging. It is the single-use packaging in particular. So my question to government being in the treaty process, going into the next INC engagements, and I feel for you with 63 hours of negotiations, I don't think I'd be sane personally after that. So good luck to all the negotiators. The question that I have from government's perspective going into this, are there priority subsectors that the department is focusing on, I suppose in the context of our own regulatory environment, but also in the global treaty? And if so, why?
Yes, so I think for us, what Anton shared earlier on is that in terms of our own consumption, as South Africa, you can just say half goes into packaging. And if you follow these packaging products, most of them are short-lived. And if you go into our environment, the studies that have been done on the most products that are leaked into the environment, you will find this packaging product. So it's not even, rocket science that you'll find that even in our own national regulations, we have prioritized packaging as, a key subsector to look into. It is critical because I think when we look at the circular economy approach, we would want products that stay longer in the economy. And the reason why we are saying the business models that Magna talked about, we would want to see reuse being more than, the recycled, those products that are having that approach, because our hierarchy is still relevant, so reuse is on top, so we prefer that. And we are not seeing more of that, especially in the packaging sector. So, hearing from business in terms of them wanting to go into that space and influence how our retail sector is operating, that's why we would want to go there. And of course, the issue of rules is critical because then you use the power of government to regulate. So packaging sector is there. I know for now we are still talking about the criteria to ensure that all of us can subject, any sector to that criteria, and it will come out such that those that are in packaging don't also feel targeted. But of course, already we are seeing the pollution out there. And it's not only packaging. I know it might not be high up, but the technology that we use, the gadgets now, I think they're designed to be with you for 12 months, or although it will still be functional, but we also have prioritized, electrical and electronic as part of our own EPR here, but also because a bigger portion of, the plastic material also goes into making up those products. So from that sense, we would want to have also a programmatic approach at a global level, meaning as and when we engage and have this conference of the parties once the instrument has been adopted, we should be able to have continuing work, because we understand that there might be other products that might come up, but because all of us will be monitoring, we should be able to bring those up as and when we need to respond. But for now, because all of us are aware of the current products or group of products that we need to work on, we are willing to ensure that packaging is on the first batch of subsectors that we work on.
Perfect, thank you. Anton, the question that I have, and you did touch on it in your presentation, I think, in fact, all three speakers have addressed this issue, and possibly prompted by our keynote speaker. I'm not sure if our keynote speaker is still with us, but I was kind of hoping for a sustainability, environmental scientist, economic scientist arm wrestle sort of on the stage. And I watched his presentation, and a chill sort of came over me in terms of, exporting our minerals and metals in unbeneficiated form and freeing up disposable income to buy more stuff. But separate discussion that we can have that arm wrestle at some point. I suppose my question to you as the plastics industry is this one around the economic impact. Do you foresee that there are risks of a legally binding instrument, both to the South African plastics industry, given that we are, I think you mentioned, the largest on the African continent in terms of plastics production industry, and I think also to the broader South African continent? Are we being overly cautious, or is there in fact a risk that we need to be very clearly aware of?
I think there's definitely a big risk. And I want to link on with what DDG said. Plastics is identified as a priority sector. If you think of the economy and the building bricks and the blocks of the economy, it's one of those three materials, steel, cement, and plastics, that is critical to any economy. So it helps economic growth. So if you're going to put in a treaty that's impractical, impossible to implement, that have such targets and binding obligations that you can't implement it in your context, it will have a negative impact on not just the plastics industry, but it will have an impact on the South African economy. So thinking of South Africa, but also the African continent, that's definitely not something that we can afford. Slides earlier is we need jobs. We need to grow the economy by creating more jobs, therefore creating more businesses. So if you're going to end up with a treaty with global standards, and I'm coming back to the global north and the global south again, there's huge differences. There's different ways of doing things. And if you're going to agree something that will fit the global north and a developed country environment, we will have difficulties. So if you have very rigid targets and deadlines and obligations, you're going to kill the African and the South African economy. So we need to be very wary around that. There's also opportunities. There are things, if we do it right, we will stimulate the circular economy. We will be able to create more jobs and opportunities. But then we need to think through this and work together to find the right solutions that's workable. Sovereignty of governments is very often questioned or coming into play as well. If you just think about trade is one of the elements that's been discussed in the treaty. To what extent can you prevent a country to import certain material or certain products, or export that for that matter? How do you if you think about Africa, there's only 3 or 4 countries that produce polymers. The rest is just importing of either raw materials for their own industry or finished goods. So again, if the treaty is very narrow and very rigid and unrealistic targets, it will have an impact. So yeah, what do we want? It's more guidelines, maybe criteria of how you apply that in your local conditions, in your local circumstances, in order to find something that's workable for you. And by that, eliminating some of the risk. But there will be risk if it's not done properly. It does come back to, do we have the capacity, do we have the skills in Africa and South Africa to implement a system like this? And then funding was raised. Funding remains a big challenge. Do we have the money to deal with that? Do we know exactly how the money will be utilized and monitored? And will that be supportive of a circular economy, or will that be punitive at the end of the day?
Yeah, and I think it was also something that I think all 3 speakers have touched on is, and I think, Meghna, in your presentation, you actually raised this point that all of the evidence to date would suggest that adopting the kind of interventions that we need is net positive in terms of job creation. I think the challenge is that there are winners and losers, is that we might be growing one sector at the expense of another. And I think, Mamokhala, you touched on this with your very last slide, and I think perhaps your last bullet point, if I'm not mistaken, was the need for a just transition. Similarly, as we're talking about with just energy transition, we're also now talking about a just circular economy transition. But I think, Meghna, it comes back to your point in terms of reducing the risk for business is to know what's coming so that as business you can prepare. And I think for government as well, to know what's coming so that we can start to reskill, upskill, to grow those new sectors that would be helping to kind of offset these. Meghna, the question that I have to you, my second question to you, is how would a global plastics treaty benefit developing economies, given the fact that we are South Africa? Anton mentioned this point about the risk of global north standards being imposed onto the global south. How do you see the benefit for us as a developing country or developing countries in general?
So to start with, I think we have slightly diverging opinions on this. The treaty would actually bring benefit to be able to invest in specific sectors, particularly waste management. And I think, where the fiscus is strapped, particularly in the context that we've just discussed this morning with our keynote speaker, there is a huge opportunity to be able to plug some of those gaps with access, the treaty would provide, particularly around standardizing product design, reducing single-use plastics, and presenting more support for waste management systems. So that's sort of one big area. And overall, I guess just simplifying the waste streams would make it more beneficial for developing economies. I think secondly would be around the promotion of EPR. I think we have that, very well in play, but for other markets would be quite key. And then thirdly, there is a provision for supporting micro and small and medium enterprises, which will be really critical for not only the South African context, but for other developing economies as well. And then that has a, play into, the waste and waste collection and recycling space, particularly. And I think if we take zoom out a little bit, there'll be more demand for sustainable plastic going forward. So how do we tap into that through the treaty and be well positioned as a developing economy? And the treaty will provide the provisions for that as well. So I think there's a lot of benefit and upside, perhaps more than we've discussed so far.
Lovely. I'm going to take a quick pause and let's see if those polls have been answered and what our audience thinks of, oh, my WhatsApp lit up like a firecracker. Let's have a look at the question and polls. Is it displayed visually? Let me just make sure. Okay. I just want to make sure I'm answering the right. Okay, so our first poll, if I have this correct, choose the top 2 funding mechanisms that you believe are needed to end plastic pollution. Can I only choose 2? The outright leader so far is EPR schemes will provide the required funding. Mamokhala, I think you spoke to that, is to say we have EPR already. it's young, we what, 2 years, not quite,
Third year this year.
going into our 3rd year. Let's give it time to mature. The PROs are settling in, producers are understanding their roles and responsibilities. So I think our audience is agreeing. Let's see how far we can come with EPR before we need to start looking at other mechanisms. Second, close on its heel, is eco-modulated levy for household general waste. Okay, so I would assume that's a pay-as-you-throw. As a household, the more you put out, the more you should pay. I'm going to put you on the spot, Mamakhala, with that one. Is there any talk about a variable fee at local government level for household general waste? If I fill up, so it's always something that makes me a little bit antsy, I think, on a Tuesday morning, where I put my big 240-litre wheelie bin, and I think the guy has to reach right down to the bottom to get the little bag, and my neighbor puts out 2, and we pay the same. So is there any talk of a modulated fee at local government level?
I think we always have to think about the practicalities of how that would work. And in terms of administering the system, you will see that it will be a bit complicated if you look at how the collection is happening currently. So I wouldn't think it could be done very fast in the near future. But I think the concept of eco-modulated fees, maybe in terms of how we had sort of structured it, we also need to link it to our own EPR systems. Because if you look at, for example, the choice of plastic packaging that brand owners have, we need to ensure that our producer responsibility organizations are able to ensure that the brand owners that choose the hard to recycle, packaging products also pay a whole lot more, because it means you will have to invest more into how you manage that particular product at the end of life. So it shouldn't be that everybody, has the flat rate, but those that are innovating and are having, the environment in mind in terms of end-of-life management, their costs need to come down. So the EPR fees also need to have the element of eco-modulation into
So that's lovely. It's great to hear that that's all on the cards. Our second poll question is: choose the top 2 factors that you believe contribute the most to plastic pollution. And a leader there, consumer behavior. So us as consumers, not too far behind irresponsible waste management. And I think consumer behavior, Magda, I have a question that I want to pose to you, is that there is an element that we haven't really touched on in our presentations today, which I think speaks to this poll as well, and that is our informal sector, our waste pickers. I saw them coming in this morning. They play such a critical role in our recycling economy, in bridging that gap between us as consumers and the recycling economy. How do you believe the treaty, because obviously for many countries it's not their reality, informal waste pickers. How do you see the treaty contributing towards the informal waste sector, to our waste pickers?
So a strong treaty will take into account the needs of the informal sector, and most importantly, provide the support they require for recognition and self-organization of those waste pickers. For us, that's critical, and enabling that just transition, introducing policies that will support existing ways of working, but also building better working conditions, providing the training required, and including them in decision-making processes. And I think that's been an element that we haven't seen come through strongly enough so far, and very applicable to the South African context. And I think, to my earlier point around global rules, simplifying the waste streams will make it easier for informal waste pickers to really, fulfill what they need to do to achieve their goals as well, and increase recycling rates and improve livelihoods. That's key. And I think overall, as we shift to a circular economy, creating more equitable and sustainable jobs will be key. As a broader informal sector, but particularly for waste pickers.
It's been lovely to see over the journey of the last INC meetings the strong participation of the informal sector in these negotiations. So it's great to see the agency and the voice that they've been given in the space as well. And I remember talking to the likes of the African Reclaimers Organization, the South African Waste Pickers Association. Their comment has always been, we want access to more and cleaner material. And I think what you've just said now in terms of simplifying, it speaks to these issues, because at the end of the day, what they want is to put more money in their pocket to support their family. And how do we help them achieve that?
Absolutely.
I think we're almost at an end, but I think, Anton, I want to wrap up just one last question, if you don't mind, with yourself. And I'm going to be a little bit kind of tongue-in-cheek. I always kind of push the envelope where I can, is that we talk about a circular plastics economy. But the circular economy is made up of 3 principles. The first is designing out pollution and waste. The second is keeping resources in flow, which is typically recycling, reuse. And the third one is regenerating natural systems. And you touched on it in terms of alternatives. I think it's been a discussion that we've had in the sector of disrupting. Does it disrupt? The issue of transitioning to alternative materials, bio-benign, bio-based, whatever they might be. How do you see the global treaty and that point coming together in terms of supporting our reduced leakage of plastic into the environment?
The treaty's whole focus is to eliminate plastic pollution, and the way to do that is to keep the material, not necessarily the product, but to keep the material for as long as possible in the circular economy. So you're quite right. If you look at the value chain is how do we redesign it? But to start even a bit earlier is how do we reformulate some of our materials? We've seen examples of multi-layers with different materials that is still multi-layer, but it's one polymer, one material. And I think that's part of the innovation that's required and the support that's required. Yes, we need to redesign, we need to rethink of products and what we put on the market. But equally important, if we don't fix the recycling part and the systems, you're going to design a perfectly new product, but it's going to end up on a landfill. Because guess what? We don't have an infrastructure to collect it and to deal with it appropriately. And it might be that you need a separate collection system than the existing ones, because we do see contamination coming through. We do see new introduction of materials, and very often it's introduced because, we're replacing plastic, and therefore, tick, it's green. But the consequences of that is dire. It has a huge impact in terms of food and food security, in terms of the recyclability of the product, and even doing what the product is meant to do. So we need to be careful in how you introduce circular economy, but give us guidelines, tell us how it should be done, but don't be prescriptive of how it should work in South Africa. Just touching on something that both of you have mentioned, the reusability of products, key to that. How do we do that? And there are examples of closed loops in the plastics industry that's been used. Wheelie bins, crates, and I can mention a few others. What we, as an industry, or Plastics SA is doing at the moment is we piloting a project, and we hope that will kick off in the next 2 months, where we will look at the reusability of secondary packaging materials, where you keep it in a cycle. Because it's a closed loop, it will be returned, and through that you reduce a huge number of waste, be it paper, be it other plastic materials. But it's how do you make it more sustainable at the end of the day. Just coming back to the informal sector as well, which is still part of the circular economy, is that we need to create the right space for them to operate. To get waste from digging into your trolley or your bin down to the bottom, or collect it from a landfill where it was contaminated with organic stuff in the same bin, compacted in a truck, and then we want to recycle it, doesn't make sense. Is there a way, and it comes back to the survey that was done as well, but can we separate it from households, take it to a central point, and there you sort it? And the waste picker can play a different role, still doing the same thing in those scenarios of either Africanized collection from host, separation at source. You know, we tend to think what Europe is doing, and we're not thinking of what can happen locally. So what's the role that they can play there? What's the role of creating a center where you can sort waste? But then what is left, the residual value, how can you beneficiate that for the community that you are working in? And that's where we need to be creative. That's where the EPR scheme, in terms of finding end-of-life solutions and things with government, with the community, work together to find those sort of solutions. So yes, there's 2 projects that we're busy working with in creating a pilot and a blueprint that can be rolled out into the future and hopefully address not just South Africa, but Africa's issues around plastic waste as well.
It's really exciting to hear that, because when I saw your graph that you had up in terms of the 17% increase in recycling for 2023, I noticed that your input slope was a little bit steeper than your output recycling slope, which I interpret as there's more contamination that's kind of going into your recycling. And again, because a lot of our plastic is coming from the informal sector, I'm suspecting that a lot of the material they're collecting is contaminated, is dirty. And obviously you don't want that contamination going into your recycling industries. So really exciting to hear that you're piloting work as well with the informal sector. We have run out of time. I know that I stand between you and I think lunch break. I think, you know, the thing that I'd like to reflect on just in closure is, I suppose, my opening statement. We know that there is an urgency to the plastic problem. We know that we are also fast-tracking the global plastic treaty process. We don't necessarily have the luxury of time to come up with a perfect treaty. I know that we are also, as different stakeholders, as government, as industry, as business, are going into this treaty with our own agendas, with our own needs, with our own responsibilities, whether it be to society, whether it be to shareholders, to business owners. And I do hope that at INC, in those 63 hours of negotiation, that we can find a middle ground that will provide us with a treaty that gives the surety that we need, that gives a level of protection that we need, that is not diluted and watered down to the effect that it's a toothless dog. And so my support to all of you going into that process, and I look forward to what comes out of the negotiations and where this will take us. And I know that what will come out will be a first step, similar to what we've seen with climate commitments. Over time, it has matured, and we've been a little bit more ambitious as well with some of those commitments. So good luck in those negotiations. Please, if you'll thank me or join me in thanking our speakers this morning. And as I said, also, if you have any questions, please do corner them during lunch or during the course of this afternoon. But thank you very much to our speakers.
Thank you.